Welcome to Audiorama Onda Lectora. Make yourself comfortable, listen and enjoy this audiobook, Awakening Imagination, Unlocking the Power Within, an audiobook journey with Neville Goddard.
Imagination, the real and eternal world of which this vegetable universe is but a faint shadow. What else is the life of man but art and science? William Blake. Imagination is more important than knowledge. Albert Einstein. Chapter 1. Where does your imagination come from? I do not rest from my great task to open the eternal worlds, to open the immortal eyes of man, into the worlds of thought. Towards eternity ever expanding in the bosom of God, the human imagination. William Blake. Certain words, with the passage of time, acquire so many strange connotations, that they almost cease to mean anything. One such word is imagination. This word is made to serve all sorts of ideas, some of them directly opposed to each other. Fantasy, thought, hallucination, suspicion, in fact, so wide is its use and so varied its meanings, that the word imagination has no fixed status or meaning. For example, we ask a man to use his imagination, meaning that his present outlook is too restricted, and therefore, not up to the task. Next, we tell him that his ideas are pure imagination, implying that his ideas are not sound. We speak of a jealous or distrustful person as a victim of his own imagination, meaning that his thoughts are false. A minute later, we pay a man the highest tribute, describing him as man of imagination. So, the word imagination has no definite meaning. Even the dictionary does not help us. It defines imagination as 1. The power of imagining or the act of the mind, the constructive or creative principle. 2. A phantasm. 3. An irrational notion or belief. 4. Planning, plotting or scheming, as involving a mental construction. I identify the central figure of the Gospels with the human imagination, the power that makes inevitable the forgiveness of sins, the attainment of our goals. All things were made through him, and without him, nothing was made that has been made. John 1:3. There is but one thing in the world, the imagination, and all our deformations of it. He is despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, Isaiah 53:3. Imagination is the very gateway to reality. Man, said Blake, is either the ark of God, or he is a phantom of earth and water. Naturally he is only an inherent organ subject to sense. The eternal body of man is the imagination, that is God himself, the divine body. Jesus, we are its members. I know of no greater and truer definition of the imagination than Blake's. By imagination, we have the power to be anything we wish to be. Through imagination, we disarm and transform the violence of the world. Our most intimate relationships, as well as the most casual, become imaginative, when we awaken to the mystery hidden from the ages, that Christ in us is our imagination. Then we realize that only if we live from imagination, can it be said that we really live. I want this book to be the simplest, clearest and most straightforward work there can be, to encourage you to function imaginatively. To open your immortal eyes inward, into the thought worlds, where you contemplate every desire of your heart, as ripe grain, white already for the harvest. I have come that you may have life, and that you may have it more abundantly. John 10:10. The abundant life that Christ promised us, is ours to experience now, but we will not be able to experience it, until we have the sense of Christ, as our imagination. The mystery hidden from the ages. Christ in you, the hope of glory, is your imagination. Colossians 1:26. This is the mystery, which I always strive to understand better, and to exhort others. Imagination is our Redeemer, the Lord from heaven, who is born of man, but not begotten of man. Every man is Mary, and must give birth to Christ. If the story of the Immaculate Conception and birth of Christ seems irrational to man, it is only because it is misunderstood as biography, history, and cosmology. And modern explorers of the imagination do not help by calling it unconscious or subconscious mind. The birth and growth of the imagination is the gradual transition from a God of tradition to a God of experience. If the birth of Christ in man seems slow, it is only because man is unwilling to let go of the comfortable but false anchorage of tradition. When imagination is discovered, as the first principle of religion, the stone of literal understanding will have felt the rod of Moses and, like the rock of Zin, will issue the water of psychological meaning, to quench the thirst of mankind. And all who take the cup offered, and live a life in accordance with this truth, will transform the water of psychological meaning, into the wine of forgiveness. So, like the Good Samaritan, they will pour it on the wounds of all. The Son of God is not found in history, nor in any external form. He can only be found as the imagination of the one in whom his presence is manifested. If your heart were the humble manger for his coming, God would be reborn as a child on earth. Man is the garden, in which sleeps this only begotten Son of God. He awakens this Son, raising his imagination to heaven, and clothing men with the stature of God. We must continue to imagine, better than we know. Man, at the moment of his awakening to imaginative life, must pass the test of sonship. Father, reveal your Son in me. And, it pleased God to reveal his Son in me. Galatians 1:15. The supreme test of sonship is the forgiveness of sin. The proof that your imagination is Jesus Christ, the Son of God, is your ability to forgive sin. Sin means to miss one's target in life, to miss one's ideal, to miss one's goal. Forgiveness means the identification of man with his ideal or goal in life. This is the work of the awakened imagination, the supreme work, because it tests man's capacity to enter into and participate in the nature of his opposite. Let the weak say, I am strong. Joel 3:10. Reasonably this is impossible. Only the awakened imagination can enter into and partake of the nature of its opposite. This conception of Jesus Christ as human imagination raises these fundamental questions. Is imagination a sufficient power, not only to enable me to suppose that I am strong, but is it also of itself capable of executing the idea? Suppose I wish to be in another place or situation, could I, imagining myself in such a state and place, bring about its physical realization? Suppose I could not afford the trip, and my present social and economic situation were opposed to the idea I wish to realize. Would imagination alone be enough to embody those desires? Does imagination comprehend reason? By reason I mean the deductions from the observations of the senses. Does it recognize the external world of facts? In the practice of daily life, is imagination a complete guide to behavior? Suppose I am able to act with continuous imagination, that is to say, suppose I am able to maintain the feeling of my wish fulfilled, will my supposition become a fact? And if it becomes a fact, will I be able to think that my actions during the incubation period have been reasonable? Is my imagination a sufficient power, not only to suppose the feeling of the wish fulfilled, but is it also by itself capable of embodying the idea? After supposing that I am already what I want to be, am I to be continually guided by reasonable ideas and actions to bring about the fulfillment of my supposition? Experience has convinced me that an assumption, though false, if persisted in, will become a fact. And that continuous imagination is sufficient for all things, and all my reasonable plans and actions will never compensate for my lack of continuous imagination. Is it not true that the teachings of the Gospels can only be received in terms of faith, and that the Son of God is constantly looking for signs of faith in people, that is, faith in their own imagination? Does the promise of, ye must believe that ye receive, and then ye shall receive, Mark 11:24, is not the same as, imagine that ye are and ye shall be? Was it not an imaginary state that Moses endured, as seeing him who is invisible? Hebrews 11:27. Was it not by the power of his own imagination that he endured? Truth depends on the intensity of the imagination, not on external facts. The facts are the fruit that bears witness to the use or misuse of the imagination. Man becomes what he imagines. He has a self-determined history. Imagination is the way, the truth, the revealed life. Truth cannot be captured solely by the logical mind. Where the natural man of sense sees a bud, the imagination sees a fully developed rose. Truth cannot be grasped by facts. As we awaken to imaginative life, we discover that to imagine that a thing is so, is what makes it so. That a true judgment need not conform to the external reality to which it relates. The imaginative man does not deny the reality of the sensual outer world of becoming. But he knows that it is the inner world of continuous imagination, the force by which the sensuous outer world of becoming becomes reality. He sees the outer world and all its events as projections of the inner world of imagination. For him, everything is a manifestation of mental activity, which takes place in the imagination of man, without the reasonable sensual man being aware of it. But he realizes that every man must become aware of this inner activity, and see the relationship between the inner causal world of imagination and the outer sensual world of effects. It is a wonderful thing to discover that you can imagine yourself in the state of your desire fulfilled, and escape from the prisons which ignorance built. The real man is a magnificent imagination. It is this self that must be awakened. Awake thou that sleepest, and arise from the dead, and Christ shall give thee light. Ephesians 5:14. The moment man discovers that his imagination is Christ, he performs acts that at this level can only be described as miraculous. But until man does not have the sense that Christ is his imagination, you have not chosen me, I have chosen you. John 15:16. Then he will see everything in pure objectivity, without any subjective relationship. Not realizing that everything he encounters is part of himself, he rebels at the idea that he has chosen the conditions of his life, that they are related by affinity to his own mental activity. Man must come to believe firmly that reality is within him, and never outside. Although others have bodies, a life of their own, their reality is rooted in you, it ends in you, as yours ends in God. Chapter 2. Sealed Instructions. The first power that meets us, on the threshold of the domain of the soul, is the power of imagination. Franz Hartmann. I was first made aware of the power, nature and redemptive function of the imagination through the teachings of my friend Abdullah. And through subsequent experiences, I learned that Jesus was a symbol of the coming of the imagination to man, that the proof of his birth in man was the individual's ability to forgive sin. That is, his ability to identify himself or another with his goal in life. Without man's identification with his goal, forgiveness of sin is an impossibility, and only the Son of God can forgive sin. Therefore, man's ability to identify himself with his purpose, even if reason and the senses deny it, is proof of the birth of Christ in him. To surrender passively to appearances, and bow to the evidence of facts, is to confess that Christ has not yet been born in you. Although this teaching shocked and repelled me at first. For I was a convinced and fervent Christian, and did not know then that Christianity could not be inherited by the mere accident of birth, but must be adopted consciously, as a way of life. Later, through visions, mystical revelations and practical experiences, it entered into my understanding, and found its interpretation, in a deeper state of mind. But I must confess that it is a complicated time, as things one has always taken for granted are shaken. Do you see these great buildings? There shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. Mark 13:2. There will not be a single stone of literal understanding left, after one drinks the water of psychological meaning. All that has been built by natural religion is cast into the flames of mental fire. However, what better way is there to understand Jesus Christ, than to identify the central character of the Gospels, with the human imagination, knowing that every time that you exercise your imagination lovingly on behalf of another, you are literally mediating from God to man, and thus feeding and clothing Jesus Christ, and that every time you imagine evil against another, you are literally striking and crucifying Jesus Christ. Every imagination of man is the cup of cold water or the sponge of vinegar, to the parched lips of Christ. Let none of you think evil in your heart against your neighbor, warned the prophet Zechariah. When man heeds this counsel, he will awaken from the imposed sleep of Adam to the full consciousness of the Son of God. For he is in the world, and the world is made by him, and the world knows him not, the human imagination. I have often asked myself, if my imagination is Jesus Christ, and everything is possible for Jesus Christ, is everything possible for me? Through experience, I have come to know that when I identify myself with my goal in life, then Christ is awake in me. Christ is sufficient for all things, and I give my life to take it back. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of myself. John 10:17. What a comfort it is to know that everything I experience is the result of my own standard of belief, that I am the center of my own web of circumstances, and that as I change, so must my outer world change. The world presents different appearances, depending on how our states of consciousness differ. What we see when we are identified with a state, cannot be seen when we are no longer merged with it. By state is meant everything that man believes, and consents to as true. No idea presented to the mind can be realized unless the mind accepts it. It depends on the acceptance, on the state with which we identify ourselves, on how things are presented. In the fusion of imagination and states, lies the configuration of the world, as it appears. The world is a revelation of the states, with which the imagination merges. It is the state from which we think, which determines the objective world in which we live. The rich, the poor, the good and the thief, are what they are, by virtue of the states from which they see the world. On the distinction between these states, depends the distinction between the worlds of these men. Individually so different is this same world. It is not the actions, and the behavior of the good man that is to be equalized, but his point of view. External reforms are useless, if the inner state is not changed. Success is not achieved by imitating the external actions of those who are successful, but by correct internal actions, and speaking inwardly. If we detach ourselves from a state, and we can do so at any time, the conditions and circumstances to which that union gave rise, vanish. It was in the fall of 1933, in New York City, when I approached Abdullah with a problem. He asked me a simple question: what do you want? I told him that I would like to spend the winter in Barbados, but I was broke. Literally, I was penniless. If you imagine that you are in Barbados, he told me, thinking and seeing the world from that state of consciousness, instead of thinking of Barbados, you will spend the winter there. You need not worry about the means of getting there, because the state of consciousness, of already being in Barbados, if occupied by your imagination, will devise the most suitable means of realization. Man lives by engaging with invisible states, fusing his imagination with what he knows to be distinct from himself, and in this union, he experiences the results of that fusion. No one can lose what he has, except by detaching himself from the state in which the things experienced have their natural life. You must imagine yourself in the state of your realized desire, Abdullah told me, and fall asleep watching the world from Barbados. The world that we describe from observation must be as we describe it, in relation to ourselves. Our imagination connects us to the desired state. But we must use imagination masterfully, not as spectators thinking in the end, but as participants, thinking from the end. We must really be there in the imagination. If we do so, our subjective experience will be objectively realized. This is not mere fantasy, he said, but a truth which you can prove by experience. His appeal to enter into the fulfilled desire was the secret of thinking from the end. Every state is already there as mere possibility, while thinking of it, but it is powerfully real when thinking from it. Thinking from the end is the way of Christ. I began right there to fix my thoughts, beyond the limits of sense. Beyond that aspect, to which my present state gave existence, to the feeling of already being in Barbados, and to see the world from that point of view. It underlined the importance of the state from which man sees the world when he falls asleep. All the prophets affirm that the voice of God is heard by man, mainly in dreams. In a dream, in a night vision, when deep sleep seizes men, when they sleep in bed, then he opens the ears of men, and seals their instruction. Job 33:15. That night, and several nights after, I fell asleep thinking I was at my father's house, in Barbados. At the end of a month a letter came to me from my brother, in which he told me that he had a great desire to get the family together at Christmas, and asked me to use the enclosed steamer ticket for Barbados. I embarked 2 days after receiving my brother's letter, and spent a wonderful winter in Barbados. This experience has convinced me that man can be anything he wants, if he makes conception habitual, and thinks from the end. It has also shown me that I can no longer excuse myself by blaming the world for external things. That my good and my evil have no other dependence than on myself. It depends on the state from which I contemplate the world, the way in which things are presented. Man, who is free in his choice, acts on the basis of conceptions which he chooses freely, though not always wisely. All conceivable states are waiting for our choice and occupation, but no rationalization will provide us by itself the state of consciousness, which is the only thing worth having. The imaginative image is the only thing to seek. The ultimate goal of the imagination is to create in us the spirit of Jesus, which is the continuous forgiveness of sins, the continuous identification of man with his ideal. Only by identifying ourselves with our goal can we forgive ourselves for not having reached it. Everything else is work in vain. On this path, to whatever place or state to which we take our imagination, to that place or state we will also gravitate physically. In my Father's house there are many dwellings. If it were not so, I would have told you. I am going to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there ye may be also. John 14:2. By sleeping in my Father's house in my imagination, as if I slept there in the flesh, I merged my imagination with that state, and was compelled to experience that state, also in the flesh. So vivid was this state to me, that I could have been seen in my Father's house, if any sentient had entered the room, where in imagination I was sleeping. A man can be seen where he is in imagination, because a man must be where his imagination is, because his imagination is himself. This I know from experience, for I have been seen by some whom I wished to be seen, when physically, I was hundreds of miles away. So I, by the intensity of my imagination and feeling, imagined and felt I was in Barbados, instead of just thinking of Barbados. So I had crossed the vast Atlantic to influence my brother to desire my presence, and thus complete the family circle at Christmas. Thinking from the end, from the feeling of my wish fulfilled, was the source of all that occurred as an external cause, such as my brother's impulse to send me a steamer ticket. And it was also the cause of everything that appeared as a result. In Ideas of Good and Evil, William Butler Yeats, having described some experiences similar to this one of mine, writes, "If all who have described events like this have not dreamed, we should rewrite our histories. For all men, certainly all imaginative men, must always be casting incantations, glamours, illusions. And all men, especially quiet men, who have no powerful selfish life, must be continually passing under its power. Determined imagination, thinking from the end, is the beginning of all miracles. But miracle is only the name given to the works of imagination, by those who do not know the power and function of imagination. Imagining oneself in the feeling of fulfilled desire is the means by which one enters a new state. This confers on the state the quality of being. Hermes tells us, what is, manifests itself, what has been or will be, does not manifest itself, but is not dead, for the soul, the eternal activity of God, animates all things. The future must become the present, in the imagination of one who wants to create wisely and consciously the circumstances. We must translate vision into being. Imagination must focus on some state, and see the world from that state. Thinking from the end is an intense perception of the world of desire fulfilled. To think from the desired state is to live creatively. Ignorance of this ability to think from the end is bondage. It is the root of all the bonds to which man is subjected. To surrender passively to the evidence of the senses underestimates the capacities of the inner self. When man understands that thinking from the end is a creative principle with which he can collaborate, he frees himself from the absurd idea of reaching his goals simply by thinking about them. He constructs all ends according to the pattern of the fulfilled desire. All life is but the appeasement of hunger, and the infinite states of consciousness, from which a man may view the world, are but a means of satisfying that hunger. The principle upon which each state is organized is some form of hunger, to raise the passion for self-gratification to higher and higher levels of experience. Desire is the mainspring of the mental machinery. It is a blessed thing. It is a right and natural craving, which has a state of consciousness as its right and natural satisfaction. But one thing I do, forgetting what lies behind, and reaching forth to what lies before, I press toward the goal. Philippians 3:13. It is necessary to have a goal in life. Without a goal, we are adrift. What wilt thou have of me? Is the implicit question, most often asked by the central figure in the Gospels. In defining your goal, you must desire it. As the heart runs after the streams of water, so my soul runs after you, O God. Psalms 42:1. The failure of man to reach his fulfillment is due to the absence of a passionate direction towards life. It is very important to bridge the gap between desire, thinking about, and satisfaction, thinking from. We must mentally move from thinking about the end to thinking from the end. And this, reason could never do. By its nature, it is restricted to the evidence of the senses, but the imagination, which has no such limitation, can do it. Desire exists to be gratified, in the activity of the imagination. Through imagination, man escapes from the limitation of the senses, and from the bondage of reason. There is nothing to hold man who can think from the end. Nothing can stop him. He creates the means, and grows his way out of limitation, towards ever greater mansions of the Lord. It matters not what has been, nor what is. The only thing that matters, is what he wants. He knows that the world is a manifestation of mental activity, which develops within him, so he strives to determine and control the ends from which he thinks. In his imagination he dwells in the end, confident that there he will dwell also in the flesh. He puts all his confidence in the feeling of desire fulfilled, and lives by committing himself to that state, for the art of fortune consists in tempting him to do so. Like the man in the pool of Bethesda, he is prepared for the movement of the waters of the imagination. Knowing that every desire is like a ripe grain to him who thinks from the end, we show indifference to the mere reasonable probability. And we trust that, through constant imagination, our assumptions will solidify and become facts. However, the dilemma persists: how to get people around the world to understand that the key is to think from the bottom line, and how to encourage this mentality in each of their actions. The real challenge lies in showing that this perspective is the very source of fulfillment in life, and not just a mere compensation for those who have been disappointed. Life is a controllable thing. You can experience whatever you please, once you realize that you are His son, and that you are what you are, by virtue of the state of consciousness, from which you think and see the world. Son, you are always with me, and all that I have is yours. Luke 15:31. Chapter 3. Highways of the Inner World. And the children wrestled within her, and the Lord said unto her, 2 nations are in thy womb, and 2 peoples shall be separated from thy bowels, and the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger. Genesis 25:22. Duality is an inherent condition of life. Everything that exists is double. Man is a dual creature, with contrary principles embedded in his nature. They struggle within him, and present attitudes to life, which are antagonistic. This conflict is the eternal enterprise, the war in heaven, the endless struggle, of the younger or inner man of the imagination, to assert his supremacy, over the older or outer man of sense. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. Matthew 19:30. He that cometh after me shall be preferred. John 1:27. The second man is the Lord from heaven. Corinthians 1:15-47. Man begins to awaken to the imaginative life, at the moment, when he feels the presence of another being in himself. In your limbs lie twin nations, rival races from birth. One will gain the mastery, the younger over the older will reign. Every man possesses 2 centers of thought or world views. The Bible speaks of these 2 views, as natural and spiritual. The natural man does not perceive the things that are of the Spirit of God, because for him they are foolishness, and he cannot understand them, because they are to be discerned spiritually. The inner body of man is as real in the world of subjective experience as his outer physical body is real in the world of external realities. But the inner body expresses a more fundamental part of reality. This existing inner body of man must be consciously exercised and directed. The inner world of thought and feeling with which the inner body is in tune, has its real structure, and exists in its own higher space. There are 2 kinds of movement, one that is according to the inner body, and one that is according to the outer body. The movement that is according to the inner body is causal, but the outer movement is under compulsion. The inner motion determines the outer, which is attached to it, bringing to the outer emotion, which is similar to the actions of the inner body. The inner motion is the force by which all events occur. The outer movement is subject to the compulsion exerted upon it, the movement of the inner body. Whenever the actions of the inner body coincide with the actions that the exterior must perform to appease the desire, that desire will be realized. Construct mentally a drama, which implies that your desire is realized, and make it imply movement of the self. Immobilize your outer physical self. Act exactly as if you were going to take a nap, and initiate the predetermined action in the imagination. A vivid representation of the action is the beginning of that action. And then, while falling asleep, consciously imagine yourself in the scene. The duration of sleep is not important, a short nap is enough, but bring the action to the dream, turn the fantasy into a fact. At first your thoughts may be like wandering sheep without a shepherd. Do not despair. If your attention wanders 70 times 7, return it 70 times 7, to its predetermined course until, by sheer exhaustion, it follows the appointed path. The inner journey should never lack direction. When you set out on the inner journey, it is to do what you were doing mentally before you started. You go for the prize, which you have already seen and accepted. In The Road to Xanadu, Professor John Livingston Lowes says, "But I have long had the feeling that this study has matured into the conviction that fantasy and imagination are not 2 powers, but one. The valid distinction that exists between them lies, not in the materials with which they operate, but in the degree of intensity of the operating power itself. Working at high tension, the imaginative energy assimilates and transmutes. In low tension, the same energy aggregates and unites images which, at their highest pitch, merge indissolubly into one. Fantasy brings together, imagination fuses. Here is a practical application of this theory. A year ago, a blind girl living in the city of San Francisco encountered a transportation problem. A change in bus routes forced her to make 3 transfers between her home and her office. This lengthened her commute from 15 minutes to more than 2 hours. She thought seriously about the problem, and decided that the solution was a car. She knew she could not drive a car, but believed that she could be driven in one. Putting to the test the theory that, as long as the actions of the inner self correspond to the actions that the outer self, physical, must perform to appease the desire, that desire will be realized. She said to herself, "I will sit here, and imagine that I am being driven to my office." Sitting in her living room, she began to imagine herself inside a car. She felt the rhythm of the engine. She imagined smelling the smell of gasoline, felt the movement of the car, touched the driver's sleeve, and felt that the driver was a man. She felt the car stop and, turning to her companion, she said, "Thank you very much, sir." To which he replied, "The pleasure is all mine." Then she got out of the car, and heard the door click shut. She told me that she focused her imagination on being in a car and, although blind, she contemplated the city from her imaginary ride. She was not thinking about the trip. She was thinking about the journey, and all that it entailed. This intentional, controlled and subjectively directed journey, raised her imagination to its fullest power. She kept her purpose always before her, knowing that there was cohesion in the intentional inner movement. In these mental journeys, an emotional continuity must be maintained, the emotion of desire fulfilled. The expectation and the desire were so intensely united, that they passed immediately from a mental state to a physical act. The inner self moves along the predetermined course best, when the emotions collaborate. We must ignite the inner self, and the best way to ignite it, is to think of great deeds, and personal benefits. We must take pleasure in our actions. On 2 successive days, the blind girl took her imaginary walk, giving her all the joy and sensory vividness of reality. A few hours after her second imaginary walk, a friend told her a story, which appeared in the evening paper. It was the story of a man who was interested in the blind. The blind girl phoned him, and told him about her problem. The next day, on his way home, he stopped at a bar, and while he was there, he had the impulse to tell the story of the blind girl, to his friend the landlord. A stranger, hearing the story, offered to take the blind girl home, every day. The man who told him the story, then told him, "See to you take her home, I will take her to work." This happened more than a year ago, and since that day, this blind girl has been taken to and from her office by these 2 gentlemen. Now, instead of spending over 2 hours on 3 buses, she is at her office in less than 15 minutes. And on that first trip to her office, she turned to her Good Samaritan and said, "Thank you very much, sir," to which he replied, "The pleasure is all mine." Thus, the objects of her imagination were for her the realities, of which the physical manifestation was only the witness. The determining animating principle was the imaginative walk. Her triumph could only surprise those who did not know her inner journey. She mentally saw the world from this imaginative journey, with such clarity of vision, that every aspect of the city acquired identity. These inner movements not only produce corresponding outer movements, this is the law that operates beneath all physical appearances. Whoever practices these bilocation exercises, will develop unusual powers of concentration and stillness, and will inevitably attain awakened consciousness, in the inner and dimensionally wider world. Performing strongly, she fulfilled her wish, for, seeing the city from the feeling of her wish fulfilled, she equaled the desired state, and granted to herself, what sleeping men ask of God. To realize her desire, an action must begin in her imagination, apart from the evidence of the senses, involving the movement of herself, and involving the fulfillment of her desire. When the external self acts to calm the desire, the latter will be realized. The movement of every visible object is not caused by things external to the body, but by things internal, operating from within outward. The journey is in yourself. You travel on the highways of the inner world. Without inner movement, it is impossible to produce anything. Inner action is an introverted sensation. By vividly imagining that you have achieved your goal, by closing your eyes and going into your thoughts, keeping your focus on the predetermined action, and actively participating in it. Then, you will be transformed into a self-determined individual. Inner action orders all things, according to the nature of itself. Try it, and see if once formulated a desirable ideal is possible, for only through this process of experimentation, you can realize your potentialities. This is how this creative principle is realized. Therefore, the key to living with purpose is to focus your imagination, in action and the feeling of the desire fulfilled, with such awareness and sensitivity, that you initiate and experience movement in the inner world. Ideas only act if they are felt, if they awaken inner movement. The inner movement is conditioned by self-motivation, the outer movement by compulsion. Wherever the sole of your foot treads, the same will I give you. Joshua 1:3. And remember, the Lord your God, in the midst of you is mighty. Zephaniah 3:17. Chapter 4. The pruning shears of the review. The second man is the Lord of heaven. Corinthians 1:15-47. He will never say, it is winter, he will say, summer is sleeping. And there is no bud small enough nor of color so sad, that Kester will not call it the beginning of the blow. Mary Webb. The first act of correction or cure is always to review. One must begin with oneself. It is one's own attitude, which must change. We can only see what we are. Emerson. Reliving each day in an imaginary way, as you wish it had been, is a very beneficial and constructive practice. By mentally reviewing the scenes, and adjusting them to your ideals, this exercise brings you health and productivity. For example, suppose today's mail brings disappointing news. Review the letter. Rewrite it mentally, and make it fit the news you wish you had received. Then, with your imagination, read the revised letter over and over again. This is the essence of revision, and revision results in revocation. The only requirement is to awaken your attention in such a way and intensity that you become completely absorbed in the revised action. You will experience an expansion and refinement of the senses, through this imaginative exercise, and finally, you will attain vision. But always remember that the ultimate goal of this exercise is to create the Spirit of Jesus, which is the continuous forgiveness of sins. Revision is of the utmost importance, when the motive is to change oneself, when there is a sincere desire to be something different, when the longing is to awaken the ideal active spirit of forgiveness. Without imagination, man remains a being of sin. Man either moves towards imagination, or remains imprisoned in his senses. To advance towards the imagination is to forgive, and forgiveness is the life of the imagination. The art of living is the art of forgiving. To forgive is, in fact, to experience in the imagination the revised version of the day, to experience in the imagination what one wishes one had experienced in the flesh. Each time one truly forgives, that is, each time one relives the event, as it should have been experienced, one is born anew. Father, forgive them. It is not the plea that comes once a year, but the opportunity that presents itself every day. The idea of forgiveness is a daily possibility, and if done with sincerity, will elevate man to higher and higher levels of being. He will experience a daily Easter, and Easter is the idea of rising transformed, and that must be almost a continuous process. Freedom and forgiveness are inextricably linked. Not to forgive is to be at war with ourselves, for we are liberated according to our capacity to forgive. Forgive and you will be forgiven. Luke 6:37. Forgive, not only out of a sense of duty or service, forgive because you want to. Thy ways are ways of pleasantness, and all thy paths of peace. Proverbs 3:17. You must take pleasure in the review. You can only forgive others effectively when you have a sincere desire to identify them with your ideal. Duty has no impetus. Forgiving is a matter of deliberately withdrawing attention from the unreviewed day, and giving it with all its force and joy to the reviewed day. If a man begins to review, even a little, the vexations and troubles of the day, then he begins to work practically upon himself. Every review is a victory over himself, and therefore, a victory over his enemy. A man's enemies are those of his own house, and his house is his state of mind. Matthew 10:36. He changes his future when he reviews his day. When a man practices the art of forgiveness, of review, however factual the scene, upon which the view then rests, he reviews it with his imagination, and beholds one never before witnessed. The magnitude of the change, which any act of revision implies, makes such a change seem utterly improbable to the realist, the man without imagination. But the radical changes in the prodigal's lot were all brought about by a change of heart. The battle that man fights is fought in his own imagination. The man who does not review the day has lost sight of that life, in the likeness of which is the true work of the Spirit of Jesus, to transform this life. All things whatsoever ye would that men should do to you, do ye even so to them, for this is the law. Matthew 7:12. Here is how an artist friend forgave herself and freed herself from pain, discomfort and dislike. Knowing that only forgetfulness and forgiveness will lead to new values, she entrusted herself to her imagination, and escaped from the prison of her senses. She writes, "On Thursday I taught all day at art school. Only one little thing spoiled the day. On entering my afternoon classroom, I discovered that the janitor had left all the chairs on top of the desks, after cleaning the floor. As I picked up a chair, it slipped out of my hands, and hit me hard on the instep of my right foot. I immediately examined my thoughts, and discovered that I had criticized the man for not doing his job well. As he had lost his assistant, I realized that he probably thought he had done more than enough, and that it had been an unwanted gift that had bounced off and hit me in the foot. Looking at my foot, I saw that both my skin and my nylons were intact, so I forgot the whole thing. That night, after I had been working intensely, for about 3 hours on a drawing, I decided to make myself a cup of coffee. To my amazement, I couldn't manage my right foot, and it hurt like hell. I jumped over to a chair, and took off my slipper to look at it. The whole foot had a strange purplish-pink color, it was swollen and red-hot. I tried to walk on it, and realized that it was shaking. I had no control over it. It seemed like one of two things: either I had broken a bone when I dropped the chair on it, or it could have something dislocated. No use speculating on what it might be. Better get rid of it at once. So I remained silent, ready to melt into light. And to my utter bewilderment, my imagination refused to cooperate. It said no, and this often happens to me when I paint. I began to argue, why not? And he kept saying, no. Finally, I gave in and said, you know it hurts. I'm trying hard not to be scared, but you're just trying. What do you want to do? The answer: go to bed and go over the day's events. So I said, okay, but let me tell you, if my foot is not perfect tomorrow morning, you have only yourself to blame. After arranging the bedding so that it didn't touch my foot, I started to go over the day. It was a little slow, as I was having a hard time taking my attention away from my foot. I reviewed the whole day, and saw nothing to add to the chair incident. But as evening fell, I found myself face to face with a man, who had not spoken to me for a year. The first time it happened, I thought he had gone deaf. I had known him since school, but we had never done more than greet each other and talk about the weather. Mutual friends assured me that I had done nothing, that he had said he had never liked me, and that in the end he had decided it wasn't worth talking about. I had said to him, "Hello," but he had not answered. I realized that I had the thought, this man is in a terrible situation, I'm going to do something to help him, and improve his situation. So, in my imagination, I stood right there, and reenacted the scene. I said, "Hello," to which he replied, "Hello," and then he smiled. Now I thought, good old Ed. I repeated the scene a couple of times, moved on to the next incident and called it a day. So now what do we do, my foot or the concert? I had been melting and rapping, a wonderful gift of courage and success, for a friend who was to debut the next day, and I was looking forward to giving it to her tonight. My imagination was taking on a solemn tone, when I expressed, "Let's do the concert, that will be more fun." However, I begged him, before we start, could we take the foot out of my imagination, which is perfectly fine in reality. And of course, he agreed. After doing so, I enjoyed the concert very much, and my friend received a tremendous ovation. At this point, I was very, very sleepy, and I fell asleep doing my project. The next morning, as I was putting on my slipper, I suddenly had a quick image in my memory, of pulling a discolored, swollen foot out of the same slipper. I pulled the foot out and looked at it. It was perfectly normal in every respect. There was a small pink spot on the instep, where I remembered I had hit it with the chair. What a vivid dream, I thought, and got dressed. While I was waiting for coffee, I walked over to the drawing table, and saw that all my brushes were in disarray and unwashed. What had caused you to leave the brushes like that? It was because of your foot. So it had not been a dream, but a beautiful healing. She had gained by the art of revision, what she would never have gained by force. In heaven, the only art of living is to forget and forgive, especially the woman. We must take our life, not as it appears to be, but from the vision of this artist, from the vision of the world made perfect, which is buried under all minds, buried and waiting for us to review the day. We are led to believe a lie when we see with, and not through the eye. William Blake. A review of the day, and what she considered so stubbornly real, was no longer so to her, and like a dream, had quietly faded away. You can revise the day to please yourself, and by experimenting in imagination, speech, and revised actions, not only modify the tendency of the history of your life, but turn all its discords into harmonies. Whoever discovers the secret of revision, can do nothing but let himself be guided by love. Its effectiveness will increase with practice. Revision is the way by which the right can find its proper power. Resist not evil, for all conflicts of passion, give rise to an exchange of characteristics. To him that knoweth to do good, and doeth it not, to him it is sin. James 41:7. To know the truth you must live the truth, and to live the truth your inner actions must coincide with the actions of your fulfilled desire. Expectation and desire must become one. Outer world is nothing but the actualized inner movement. Through ignorance of the law of revision, those who wage war are perpetually defeated. Only concepts that idealize represent the truth. Your ideal of man is his truest self. For I firmly believe, that all that is most deeply imaginative is, in reality, most directly practical. I ask you to live imaginatively, and think of, and personally appropriate the transcendent saying, Christ in you, the hope of glory. Don't blame, just resolve. It is not man and earth in its most beautiful state, but you practicing the art of revision, make paradise. The proof of this truth, can only be in your own experience of it. Try to review the day. To the pruning shears of revision, we owe our best fruits. Chapter 5. The Coin of Heaven. Does the firm persuasion that a thing is so, make it so? And the prophet answered, all poets believe it does, and in ages of imagination, this firm persuasion removed mountains, but many are not capable of a firm persuasion of anything. William Blake. Marriage of heaven and hell, let every man be fully persuaded of what he thinks. Romans 14:5. Persuasion is an inner effort of intense attention. To listen attentively as if you were hearing is to evoke, to activate. By listening, you can hear what you want to hear, and persuade those beyond the reach of the outer ear. Speak it inwardly, only in your imagination. Make your inner conversation coincide with your desire fulfilled. What you wish to hear without, you must hear within. Accept and welcome the power within, and become one who listens only to what is related to the fulfillment of your desires. Then, all the external events of the world will become a bridge, which will lead you towards the materialization of your goals. Your inner speech is perpetually written around you in events. Learn to relate these events to your inner speech, and you will become a self-taught person. By inner speech, we mean those mental conversations, which you hold with yourself. They may be inaudible when you are awake, because of noise, and distractions from the outside world of becoming, but they are quite audible in deep meditation, and in sleep. But whether audible or inaudible, you are their author, and you form your world in their likeness. There is a God in heaven, and heaven is within you, who reveals secrets and makes known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in the last days. These are your dreams, and the visions of your head upon your bed. Daniel 2:28. Inner speech from the premises of desire fulfilled, is the way to create an intelligible world for yourself. Observe your inner speech, for it is the cause of future action. Inner speech reveals the state of consciousness, from which you see the world. Make your inner speech coincide with your fulfilled desire, because your inner speech manifests itself around you in events. If anyone does not offend in word, he is a perfect man, and capable also of restraining the whole body. Behold, we put bridle in the horse's mouth, so that they obey us, and we turn their whole body. Behold also the ships, which though they are so great, and are driven by impetuous winds, with a very small rudder, they turn them whithersoever the governor directs them. So also the tongue is a small member, and boasts of great things. Behold what a great thing a little fire kindleth. James 3:5. All the world manifested, goes to show us what use we have made of the word, inward speech. An uncritical observation of our inner speech will reveal to us the ideas from which we see the world. The inner speech reflects our imagination, and our imagination reflects the state with which it is fused. If the state with which we are merged is the cause of the phenomenon of our life, then we are relieved of the burden of wondering what to do. For we have no alternative but to identify with our objective. And to the extent that the state with which we are identified is reflected in our inner speech, then to change the state with which we are merged, we must first change our inner speech. It is our inner conversations that make the events of tomorrow. Put off the old conversation, the old man, which is corrupt, and be renewed in the spirit of your mind. Put on the new man, created in righteousness. Ephesians 4:22. Our minds, like our stomachs, are quickened by the change of food. Quintillions stop all the old and mechanical negative inner speech, and begin a new positive and constructive inner speech, from premises of desire fulfilled. Inner speech is the beginning, the sowing of the seeds of future action. To determine the action, you must consciously initiate and control your inner speech. Construct a sentence, which implies the fulfillment of your goal, such as, I have a large, stable and reliable income, consistent with integrity and mutual benefit, or, I am happily married, I am loved, I am contributing to the good of the world. And repeat such a phrase over and over again, until you feel inwardly affected by it. Our inner language represents in various ways the world in which we live. In the beginning was the Word. What you sow, that you shall reap. John 1:1. Look at those fields. The sesame was sesame, and the corn was corn. Silence and darkness knew it. Thus the destiny of man is born. The light of the end of Asia runs faithful to its origins. Those who go in search of love only make manifest their own lovelessness. And those who do not love never find love, only those who love find love, and never have to look for it. Herbert Lawrence. Man attracts what he is. The art of life consists in keeping the feeling of desire fulfilled, and letting things come to you, not going after them, nor thinking that they flee. Observe your inner speech, and remember your goal. Does your inner speech coincide with what you would audibly say, if you had achieved your goal? The inner speech and actions of the individual attract the conditions of his life. Through uncritical self-observation of your inner speech, you discover where you are in the inner world, and where you are in the inner world is what you are in the outer world. You clothe yourself in the new man, whenever the ideals and inner speech coincide. Only in this way can the new man be born. Inner speech matures in the darkness, and out of the darkness it comes to the light. The right inner speech is the speech that would be yours, if you would realize your ideal. In other words, it is the speech of desire fulfilled. I am that. There are two gifts that God has granted only to man, and to no other mortal creature. These two are mind and speech, and the gift of mind and speech is equivalent to the gift of immortality. If a man uses these two gifts aright, he will differ in nothing from the immortals. And when he leaves the body, mind and speech will be his guides. And by them, he will be led to the troop of gods and souls, who have attained bliss. The circumstances and conditions of life are the inner speech externalized, the sound solidified. The inner speech calls events into existence. In every event, there is the creative sound, which is its life and being. All that a man believes and consents to as true, is revealed in his inner speech. It is his word, his life. Try to notice what you are saying in yourself at this moment, to what thoughts and feelings you are consenting. They will weave themselves perfectly into the tapestry of your life. To change your life, you must change your inner speech, because life, said Hermes, is the union of word and mind. When the imagination match your inner speech with the desire fulfilled, there will then be a straight path in yourself, from the inside out. And the outside will instantly reflect the inside to you, and you will know that reality is only inner speech actualized. Receive with meekness the innate word, which can save your souls. James 1:21. Every stage of man's progress is realized by the conscious exercise of his imagination, matching his inner speech with his realized desire. As man does not match them perfectly, the results are uncertain, whereas they might be perfectly certain. The persistent assumption of the fulfilled desire is the means of realizing the intention. As we control our inner speech, matching it with our fulfilled desires, we can let go of all other processes. Then we simply act, through clear imagination and intention. We imagine the desire fulfilled, and we hold mental conversations from that premise. Through mental conversations, controlled from premises of desire fulfillment, apparent miracles are realized. The future becomes the present, and is revealed in our inner speech. To be sustained by the inner discourse of desire fulfillment is to be securely anchored in life. Our lives may seem broken by events, but they are never broken, as long as we retain the inner discourse of wish fulfillment. All happiness depends on the active and voluntary use of imagination, to build and affirm inwardly, that we are what we want to be. We pair ourselves with our ideals, constantly remembering our goal, and identifying ourselves with it. We merge with our goals, occupying ourselves frequently, with the sensation of our desire fulfilled. Frequency, habitual occupation, is the secret of success. The more often we do it, the more natural it becomes. Fantasy gathers, and continuous imagination merges. It is possible to solve any situation, by the proper use of imagination. Our task is to get the right phrase, the one that implies that our desire is realized, and ignite the imagination with it. All this is intimately related to the mystery of the still small voice. The inner chatter reveals the activities of the imagination, activities which are the causes of the circumstances of life. As a rule, man is totally unconscious of his inner chatter, and therefore does not see himself as the cause, but as the victim of circumstances. To consciously create circumstances, man must consciously direct his inner speech, matching the gentle little voice with his realized desires. Call the things that are not seen as if they were seen. Romans 4:17. The right inner speech is essential, it is the greatest of arts. It is the way from limitation to freedom. Ignorance of this art has made the world a battlefield and a penitentiary, where only blood and sweat is expected, when it should be a place of awe and wonder. Speaking correctly on the inside is the first step to becoming what one wants to be. Speech is an image of the mind, and the mind is an image of God. On the morning of April 12, 1953, my wife was awakened by the sound of a great voice of authority, speaking within and saying, "You must stop wasting your thoughts, your time and your money. Everything in life must be an investment. Spending is wasting, squandering, investing without return. To invest is to allocate something for a purpose, from which a return is expected." This revelation of my wife is about the importance of the moment. It is about the transformation of the moment. What we desire is not in the future, but in ourselves, and in this very moment. At any moment of our life, we are faced with an infinite choice, what we are and what we want to be. And what we want to be already exists, but to realize it, we must adapt our inner speech, and our actions to it. If two of you shall agree on earth, whatsoever they shall ask, it shall be done for them of my Father which is in heaven. Matthew 18:19. Only what is done now counts. The present moment does not recede into the past. It moves forward into the future to face us, spent or invested. Thought is the currency of heaven, and money is its earthly symbol. Every moment must be invested, and our inner conversation reveals whether we are spending or investing. Be more interested in what you are saying now, inwardly, than in what you have said, choosing wisely what you think and what you feel now. Every time we feel misunderstood, misused, neglected, mistrusted, fearful, we are wasting our thoughts, and wasting our time. Every time we take on the feeling, to be what we want to be, we are investing. We cannot abandon the moment to negative inner chatter, and expect to keep the control of life. Before us go the results, of all that is apparently left behind. The last moment is not gone, but approaching. My word will not return to me empty, but will do what I will, and prosper in that to which I sent it. Isaiah 55:11. The circumstances of life are the muffled expressions of the inner speaking that made them, the Word made visible. The Word, said Hermes, is Son, and the mind is Father of the Word. They are not separate from each other, for life is the union of word and mind. He chose us to be His children, through the word of truth. James 1:18. Let us be imitators of God as dear children, and let us wisely use our inner word, to shape an outer world in harmony with our ideal. Ephesians 5:1. The Lord spake by me, and His word was in my tongue. Samuel 2:23-2. The mouth of God is the mind of man. Feed God only with the best. Whatsoever things are of good report, think on these things. Philippians 4:8. The present moment is always precisely the right time for an investment, to speak the right word inwardly. The word is very close to you, in your mouth and in your heart, so that you can put it into practice. Look, today I have set before you life and good, death and evil, blessings and curses. Deuteronomy 30:14. You choose life and good and blessings, being that which you choose. The like is known only by the like. Make your inner speech bless, and give good reports. Man's ignorance of the future is the result of his ignorance of his inner speech. His inner speech reflects his imagination, and his imagination is a government, in which the opposition never comes to power. If the reader asks, what if the inner speech remains subjective, and he cannot find an object for his love? The answer is, it will not remain subjective, for the simple reason, that inner speech always objectifies itself. What frustrates and festers, and becomes the disease that afflicts mankind, is man's ignorance of the art of matching the inner words with the desire fulfilled. Inner speech reflects imagination, and imagination is Christ. Alter your inner speech, and your perceptive world will change. Whenever inner speech and desire are in conflict, inner speech invariably wins. Since the inner speech objectifies itself, it is evident that if it aligns with the desire will be fulfilled in reality. If this were not so, we would agree with Blake, who stated that he would rather kill a child in the cradle than nurture unfulfilled desires. But from my experience, I know that the tongue can set fire to the course of nature. James 3:6. Chapter 6. Everything is inside. Rivers, mountains, cities, towns, all are human, and when you enter their breasts, you walk in heavens and earths, as in your own bosom you carry your heaven and earth, and all that you behold. Though it seem outside, it is within, in your imagination, of which this world of mortality is but a shadow. William Blake. The inner world was as real to Blake as the outer land of waking life. He considered his dreams and visions as the realities of the forms of nature. Blake reduced everything to the foundations of his own consciousness. The kingdom of heaven is within you. Luke 17:21. The real man, the imaginative man, has invested the outer world with all its properties. The apparent reality of the external world, which he finds so hard to dissolve, is but the proof of the absolute reality of the inner world of his own imagination. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. I and my Father are one. John 6:44 and 10:30. The world described by observation is a manifestation of the mental activity of the observer. When man discovers that his world is his own mental activity made visible, that no one can come to him unless he attracts it, and that there is no one to change but himself, his own imaginative self, his first impulse is to remodel the world in the image of his ideal. But his ideal is not so easily embodied. The moment he ceases to conform to external discipline, he must impose on himself a much more rigorous discipline, the self-discipline on which depends the realization of his ideal. The imagination is not entirely free to move as it pleases, without any rules to limit it. And in fact, the opposite is true. The imagination moves according to habit, and it can choose, but it chooses according to habit. Awake or asleep, the imagination of man is constrained to follow certain definite patterns. It is this numbing influence of habit which man must change. If he does not, his dreams will fade away under the paralysis of habit. The imagination, which is Christ in man, is not subject to the necessity to produce only what is perfect and good. It exercises its absolute freedom from necessity, endowing the outer physical being with free will, to choose to follow good or evil, order or disorder. You must choose today whom you will serve. Joshua 24:15. But once the choice is made and accepted, so that it forms the habitual consciousness of the individual, then the imagination manifests its infinite power and wisdom, molding the outer sensual world of becoming, in the image of the individual's habitual inner speech and actions. To realize his ideal, man must first change the pattern, which his imagination has followed. Habitual thinking is indicative of character. The way to change the outer world is to make the inner speech and action match the outer speech and action of the fulfilled desire. Our ideals are waiting to be embodied, but unless we ourselves match our inner speech and action with the speech and action of desire fulfilled, they are unable to be born. Inner speech and action are the channels of God's action. He cannot answer our prayer unless these ways are offered. Man's outward behavior is mechanical. He is subject to compulsion, which applies to him the behavior of the inner self, and the old habits of the inner self remain, until they are replaced by new ones. It is a special characteristic of the human being, the inner or second self, which influences the external reality, similar to its own nature. Any change in the behavior of the inner being will produce corresponding external changes. The mystic calls death a change of consciousness. By death he means, not the destruction of the imagination, and of the state with which it was fused, but the dissolution of its union. Fusion is union, and not unity. Thus, the conditions to which that union gave being, vanish. "I die every day," said Paul to the Corinthians. William Blake said to his friend Crabb Robinson, "There is nothing like death. Death is the best thing that can happen in life, but most people die late, and it takes so little time to die. God knows that their neighbors never see them rise from the dead." To the outer man of sense, who knows nothing of the inner man of being, this is sheer nonsense. However, William Blake made the above very clear, when he wrote a year before he died, "One who is delighted to be in good company." He was born on November 28, 1757, in London, and has died several times since. When man has the sense of Christ as his imagination, he sees why Christ must die and rise from the dead, to save man. For he must detach his imagination from its present state, and match it with a higher conception of himself, if he would rise above his present limitations, and so save himself. Here is a beautiful story of a mystical death, witnessed by a neighbor. "Last week," writes the one who rose from the dead, "a friend offered me her house in the mountains for the Christmas vacations, as she was planning to go east. She told me that she would let me know this week. We had a very pleasant conversation, and I mentioned you and your teachings, in connection with a discussion of Experiment with Time, by Donne, which she had been reading. Your letter arrived on Monday, and on picking it up, I had a sudden feeling of depression. However, when I read it, he told me I could have the house, and told me where to get the keys. Instead of rejoicing, I became even more depressed, so much so, that I decided there must be something between the lines, which I sensed. I unfolded the letter, read the first page, and as I turned to the second, I noticed that he had written a postscript on the back of the first page. It consisted of an extremely blunt description of an unpleasant trait of my character, which I had struggled for years to overcome, and which I thought I had achieved in the last 2 years. Yet, here it was again, described with clinical accuracy. I was stunned and devastated. I thought, what is this letter trying to tell me? In the first place, he invites me to use his house, as I have seen myself staying in some lovely home, during the vacations. Secondly, nothing comes to me unless I draw it. And thirdly, I have received nothing but good news. So, the obvious conclusion is that something in me corresponds to this letter, and no matter what it looks like, it is good news. I read the letter again, and in doing so I asked myself, what is there for me to see? And then I saw it. It began, after our conversation last week, I think I can tell you, and the rest of the page was as sprinkled with whers and wazes, like currants in a seed cake. I was overcome with a great sense of jubilation. It was all in the past, and what I had worked so hard to correct was done. Suddenly I realized that my friend was a witness of my resurrection. I went around the studio singing, "It's all in the past. It is done." I gathered all my gratitude into a big ball of light, and shot it straight at you, and if you saw a flash of lightning on Monday evening, shortly after 6, that was it. Now, instead of writing a polite letter, because it is the right thing to do, I may write thanking you sincerely for your candor, and thanking you for the loan of your house. Many thanks for your teachings, which have made my beloved imagination, truly my Savior. And now, if someone says to her, "Look, here is Christ," she will not believe it. Because she knows that the kingdom of God is within herself, and that it is her responsibility to take on the whole incarnation of His ideal. She understands that only through death and resurrection, it will be possible to achieve it. She has found her Savior, her beloved imagination, expanding forever in the bosom of God. There is only one reality, and that is Christ. The human imagination, inheritance and final realization of all mankind, that we, speaking the truth in love, may grow up in all things into Him who is the head, that is Christ. Ephesians 4:14. Chapter 7. Creation is finished. I am the beginning and the end, there is nothing to come that has not been and will be. Ecclesiastes 3:15. Blake saw all possible human situations as already made states. He saw every aspect, every plot and every drama, already worked out as mere possibilities, while we are not in them, but as overpowering realities when we are in them. He described these states as sculptures of the halls. He differentiated them, therefore, between states and individual identities, in those states. States change, but individual identities never change or cease, said Blake. Imagination is not a state, it is human existence itself. Affection or love becomes a state when separated from the imagination. It is almost impossible to say how important it is to remember this, but the moment, when the individual realizes this for the first time, is the most momentous of his life. And to be encouraged to feel this is the highest form of encouragement that it is possible to give. This truth is common to all men, but the consciousness of it, and much more, the self-consciousness of it, is another thing. The day I understood this great truth, that everything in my world, is a manifestation of mental activity, which takes place within me. And that the conditions and circumstances of my life, only reflect the state of consciousness, with which I am merged, is the most momentous of my life. But the experience that led me to this certainty, is so far removed from ordinary existence, that for a long time I hesitated to tell it. Because my reason refused to admit the conclusions, to which the experience prompted me. However, this experience revealed to me that I am supreme, within the circle of my own state of consciousness, and that it is the state with which I identify myself, which determines what I experience. Therefore, it should be shared with everyone, because to know this is to free oneself from the greatest tyranny in the world, the belief in a second cause. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Matthew 5:8. Blessed are those, whose imagination has been so purged of belief in second causes, that they know that imagination is everything, and everything is imagination. One day I slipped quietly, from my apartment in New York City, to some remote countryside of yesteryear. As I entered the dining room of a large inn, I became fully conscious. I knew that my physical body was immobilized, in my New York bed. However, here I was more awake and aware than ever. I knew intuitively, that if I could stop the activity of my mind, everything before me would freeze. As soon as the thought was born, I was overcome with the impulse to try. I felt my head contracting, then thickening, until I became immobile. My attention was focused on a crystalline spotlight, and the waitress walking, not walking. And I looked out the window, and the falling leaves were not falling. And the family of 4 eating, not eating. And them lifting the food, they weren't lifting it. Then my attention relaxed, the tension eased, and suddenly, everything took its course. The leaves fell, the waitress walked, and the family ate. Then I understood Blake's vision of the sculptures of the halls. I sent you to mow that, in which you put no work. John 4:38. Creation is finished. I am the beginning and the end, there is nothing to come that has not been and will not be. Ecclesiastes 3:15. The world of creation is finished, and its original is within us. We saw it before we left, and since then, we try to remember it and activate sections of it. There are infinite visions of it. Our task is to get the right vision, and by a certain direction of our attention, make it pass in procession, before the inner eye. If we assemble the right sequence, and experience it in the imagination, until it has the tone of reality, then we consciously create the circumstances. This inner procession is the activity of the imagination, which must be consciously directed. Through a series of mental transformations, we become aware of larger and larger portions, of what already is. And by matching our own mental activity, with that portion of creation that we wish to experience, we activate it, resurrect it, and give it life. This experience of mine, not only shows the world, as a manifestation of the mental activity of the individual observer, but also reveals our course of time, as leaps of attention between eternal moments. An infinite gulf separates any two of our moments. We, by the movements of our attention, give life to the sculptures of the halls. Think of the world as containing an infinite number of states of consciousness, from which it could be contemplated. Think of these states, as rooms or mansions in the house of God, and like the rooms of any house, they are fixed with respect to each other. But think of yourself, the real self, the imaginative you, as the living and moving occupant, of the house of God. Each room contains some of the sculptures of the halls, with infinite plots and dramas, and situations already worked out but not activated. They are activated as soon as the human imagination enters, and merges with them. Each one represents certain mental and emotional activities. To enter a state, man must consent to the ideas and feelings it represents. These states represent an infinite number of possible mental transformations that man can experience. To pass to another state or mansion, a change of beliefs is necessary. Everything you can desire is already present, and only waits for your beliefs to match it. But it must be matched, because it is the necessary condition, so that it can be activated and objectified. Matching the beliefs of a state, is the search it finds, the call it opens to, the request it receives. It enters and possesses the earth. At the moment, when man matches the beliefs of any state, he merges with it, and this union, gives rise to the activation and projection of its plots, plans, dramas and situations. It becomes the home of the individual, from which he sees the world. It is his workshop, and if he is observant, he will see how the external reality is modeled according to the model of his imagination. It is for this purpose, to train us in the creation of images, that we were made, subject to the limitations of the senses, and clothed in bodies of flesh. It is the awakening of the imagination, the return of his Son, that our Father awaits. The creature was subjected to vanity, not willingly, but for the sake of him who subjected it. Romans 8:20. But the victory of the Son, the return of the prodigal, assures us that the creature will be delivered from the bondage of corruption, to the glorious liberty of the sons of God. Romans 8:21. We were subjected to this biological experience, because no one can know the imagination, who has not been subjected to the vanities and limitations of the flesh. Who has not taken his share of sons, and become prodigal, who has not experienced and tasted this cup of experience. And the confusion will continue, until man awakens, and a fundamentally imaginative view of life has been re-established and recognized as basic. I must preach the unsearchable riches of Christ, and make all see what is the fellowship of the mystery, which from the beginning of the world is hidden in God, who created all things by Jesus Christ. Ephesians 3:8. Keep in mind that Christ in you is your imagination. Just as the appearance of our world is determined by the particular state with which we are merged. So too, we can determine our destiny as individuals, by merging our imagination with ideals we seek to realize. On the distinction between our states of consciousness depends the distinction between the circumstances and conditions of our lives. Man, who is free in his choice of state, often cries out to be saved from the state of his choice. And ye shall cry out in that day, because of your king whom ye have chosen you, and the Lord will not hear you in that day. However, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and said, No, but we will have a king over us. Samuel 1:8-18. Choose wisely the state you will serve. All states are lifeless, until the imagination is fused with them. All things when they are admitted, are made manifest by light, for whatsoever is made manifest is light. Ephesians 5:13. And ye are the light of the world, by which those ideas, to which ye have consented, are made manifest. Matthew 5:14. Hold fast to your ideal. Nothing can take it away from you, except your imagination. Do not think of your ideal, think from it. Only the ideals from which you think are realized. Man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God, and the mouth of God is the mind of man. Matthew 4:4. Become a drinker and eater of the ideals you wish to realize. You must have a fixed and definite aim, or your mind will wander, and wandering, it eats up every negative suggestion. If you live right mentally, everything else will be all right. By a change of mental diet, you can alter the course of observed events. But unless there is a change of mental diet, your personal history remains the same. You brighten or darken your life, depending on the ideas you accept. Nothing is more important to you than the ideas you feed on. And you feed on ideas, from which you think. If you find the world unchanged, it is a sure sign that you lack fidelity to the new mental diet, which you neglect to condemn your environment. You need a new and sustained attitude. You can be anything you want, if you make conception habitual, for any idea, which excludes all others from the field of attention, is discharged into action. The ideas and states of mind, to which you constantly return, define the state with which you are merged. Therefore, train yourself to occupy more frequently the feeling of your desire fulfilled. This is creative magic. It is the way to work towards merging with the desired state. If you would take up more often the feeling of your desire fulfilled, you would be master of your destiny, but unfortunately, you close yourself to taking it up during all but the occasional hour. Practice making the feeling of desire fulfillment real for yourself. After you have assumed the feeling of desire fulfillment, do not close the experience as you would a book, but carry it with you like a fragrant scent. Instead of forgetting it completely, let it remain in the atmosphere, communicating its influence automatically to your actions and reactions. A state of mind, repeated often, acquires a momentum, which is difficult to break or check. So be careful what feelings you harbor. Habitual moods reveal the state with which you are merged. It is always possible to move from thinking about the end you wish to realize, to thinking from the end. But the crucial issue is to think from the end, because thinking from means unification or fusion with the idea, whereas in thinking from the end, there is always subject and object, the thinking individual and the thing thought. You must imagine yourself, in the state of your desire fulfilled, in your love for that state, and in doing so live and think from it, and no more of it. You move from thinking in, to thinking from, by centering your imagination on the feeling of the desire fulfilled. Chapter 8. The apple of God's eye. What think ye of the Christ? Who is the Son? Matthew 22:42. When you are asked this question, you must answer, Christ is my imagination. And though I do not yet see all things put under him, I feel that I am Mary, of whom sooner or later he will be born, and finally, he will do all things through Christ. Hebrews 2:8. The birth of Christ is the awakening of the inner man, or the second man. It is to become aware of the mental activity within oneself, activity that continues, regardless of whether we are conscious of it or not. The birth of Christ does not bring any person from a distance, nor does it bring into existence something that did not exist before. It is the revelation of the Son of God, in man. The Lord cometh in the clouds, is the description the prophet uses, to refer to the shining rings of golden liquid light, which appear over the head of the one, in whom the Spirit. The coming is from within and not from without, as Christ is immerse. This great mystery that God manifested in the flesh, begins with Advent, and it is appropriate that the purification of the temple, which temple are ye, is placed in the foreground of the Christian mysteries. Corinthians 1:3-17. The kingdom of heaven is within you. Luke 17:21. Advent is revealing the mystery of your existence. If you practice the art of reflection, through a life lived, using wisely to dialogo interior and your internal actions, trusting that through the conscious use of the force that acts in us, then Christ will awaken in you. If you believe and trust in it, acting accordingly, Christ will awaken within you. This is Advent. Great is the mystery, God was manifested in flesh. Timothy 1:3-16. From Advent, he who touches you, touches the apple of God's eye. Zechariah 2:8.
As we conclude this transformative audiobook journey, may the wisdom of Neville Goddard continue to resonate within you, guiding you towards a life filled with purpose, abundance, and boundless imagination. Remember, the power to shape your reality lies within you. Embrace the infinite possibilities that await, and may your journey be filled with joy, fulfillment, and endless discoveries. Farewell, and may your imagination forever be your greatest ally on the path to awakening.